Bierens with the team did the digital deficit of the NIS2 Directive regulatory tensions that hinder the management of digital security risks. Here.
Yes. So, thank you for having me. The digital deficit of the NIS2 Directive. For people who are not from Europe, the NIS2 Directive is a directive which is new in. Where is it? Yeah, thank you. So the NIS2 is the new cybersecurity, the updated cybersecurity regulation in Europe. And what the regulation did is it made a couple of changes to the NIS1, which is the previous one. And the essential major change they did is they wanted to have Europe on the higher level of cyber resilience, and therefore wanted to include more organizations as being under the regulation. Simultaneously, they updated several things. They extended the definition, so the definition is now become everything connected to the network of an organization, which is much bigger than it previously was. They also extended the definition of the use of cloud, so the cloud as being used is also included. And also they included very specific mandatory measures. And even a personal liability claim was added to make sure that every organization at the C-level was actually making sure they were doing this. So when the NIS2 came out in Europe, since it touches upon national security, it needs to be translated into local law. So there is this 1-2 year gap between the rule being set and then the local law being final. And in that period, I decided to interview a number of people from various sectors. So you have energy, municipalities, transportation, drinking water, so all kinds of organizations where I interviewed both the CISO as well as the cybersecurity responsible person, as well as the IT or C-level person having the final responsibility and therefore carrying the liability. After doing that, we went to various workshops to validate the outcomes if they were actually applicable just also beyond the group. And that group was in an interesting position because some of them were already considered critical national infrastructure. Many of them were not. And in the end, every organization came under the new NIS2 regulation. And the question we came up with is, in this what we call the interbellum, how are they responding? Are they already starting the implementation of measures? Are they finding the measures now new? So what was the organizational behavior with regards to that outcome? We divided it up into three specific tensions. One tension we found is that we found the tension between compliance management and digital risk management. And there were basically two views on it. There was the congruent view, where they said, well, for us, digital security risk management equals compliance management. And there was the incongruent view, where they said, well, it's not the same. And if you put that into a diagram using the Goya methodology, you can actually see that it becomes an interesting overview of the tensions, because you're seeing that the concurrent view is quite successful in getting organizations moving. However, it doesn't mean that becoming compliant becomes their only goal. So the only thing you really are aiming for is to become compliant. Whereas the incongruent view says, well, the technology is going so quickly, compliance can never be enough. By the time you have reached agreement on what compliance should look like, AI may have come in, quantum may have come in, so new technologies are coming much more quicker than compliance can ever follow. So there is a dynamic nature of that which you need to take into account. account. Also, very specifically seen within the no way you can actually be 100% secure. There's always a residual risk, so you need to take that into account as well. Whereas compliance is much more black and white. Either you are compliant or you're not compliant, and then you get a number of measures you need to take in order to become compliant. So what you see in the center of this tension is that it's, on the one hand, there's managing compliance, and some organizations are already happy if they're able to manage compliance. Other ones say, well, you should really start with security risk management, and then compliance will follow. So, and they were actually quite firm in that, saying, you may even state that if you start with compliance, then the moment you become compliant, it becomes very difficult to go beyond because you are compliant. Tension number 2 was on the liability part. And we extended it a bit into what we called single and shared risk ownership, where we also seeing 2 perspectives. One is the attribution perspective, where they're saying, well, I really want to make somebody, person, or organization responsible, accountable, liable to do something. And then on the other hand, you have the collaborative perspective, where they're saying, well, we all share a common responsibility and everybody has a bit of that responsibility. So that resulted in the same kind of diagram. As you can see, the attribution perspective saying, well, liability and accountability are being used in that interbellum to actually prioritize the behavior. So making somebody liable actually make sure that the CEO director really understands and feels that threat basically to him or her. So they will do something with that. However, when you really interview them on a personal level, they are very adamant, saying, well, if I'm being sued, then I just get an insurance and it's all solved and I go on my normal business. So it's very debatable if this is really effective. What we also found is that the attribution doesn't stop within the organization. Like I said, cloud became part of the scope. So that means third parties are coming into the scope as well. And almost all interviewers were worried about the supply chain, especially the first, what they call the third-party supply chain risks. On the collaborative part, they said, well, everybody needs to improve on it. However, we need a different approach. And that came about with one incident, which in the cybersecurity domain, they call Log4j, which is an open source a module used by many software vendors, which became a problem. But if you put that into a scientific research which has been done on that specific use case, you're seeing that the risk has moved from the third party into the fourth and the fifth. So we call it the nth party risk. However, when you talk nth party risk, you are beyond legal liabilities, because you can only have a contract with one person and not the person behind or the organization behind it, let alone an open source component, which is 1 or 3 or 4 steps away. So that's an interesting observation, because it was a very well acknowledged example, mentioned very often. However, they were not aware that they were mentioning something which is beyond their legal possibility to manage. And then as a final tension, the national versus the global perspective, because each law, each directive being on European level was transmitted into local laws. However, the internet is not local. The internet is global by design. So that meant if you make it local, you're putting in an interesting dynamic between government, being the local regulator, but also how does it compare to big tech companies? We call them data sovereignty. So they have another data sovereignty almost you can put on there. And at the same time, you have the imperfect market forces. So that resulted in the final diagram on the Goya methodology, where we're saying, well, we're seeing that every organization that is being put under the NIS2 agrees that it should be there. But that's the good part. However, the willingness to pay, to invest, in order to actually prevent that from happening is quite minimal.
The camera.
Oh, sorry. So, but what we found is that if you make a product or a service more expensive, there is less willingness to pay for it. So people need to understand why they're paying for it. And we found this in various dynamics where even C-level people in the critical infrastructure domain and the transportation domain said, well, we are aware that we are taking a risk by going beyond compliance. Because if I'm competing against another transportation company who isn't doing that on that level, they will be cheaper. And how do we get government, for example, as a procurer, or organizations or consumers as a procurer, to understand that it may be more expensive, however, you need to understand why that's still of benefit to you. Then you're in the market forces domain. So that means that you are really dependent on, in this case, government to make sure that the market forces are operating properly. So this is the middle outcome, as we call it. So the role of government is critical. At the same time, many of the interviewers, informants state that they don't feel that government has the right knowledge, and they also don't have the right governance because they're just a government of one country. They're not government of Europe, or they don't have the ability to do that. Finally, several said, well, but if you make me liable as a C-level, as a CEO or CIO, for something I cannot control, how can you make me liable? So how do you expect me to deal with a large company like Amazon, or like Google, or with Microsoft, or with Siemens, or with ABB? Because I don't have the negotiation power to actually make sure that they help me in managing risk. So if risk occurs, then I'm the one who's actually being held liable. However, I'm going to put that into the hands of the big tech. So that means you're into countries competing with each other, combating each other, spying on each other in the digital domain. In all sense, there's an imbalance in the end. So this is the qualitative part of the research, and in the paper, one of the final paragraphs is to see if we could find objective research on the quantitative side by surveys to see if it was actually recognized what we found in our interviews. And as you can see on this sheet, so two major objective quantitative research were found by SANS and EXO, the European Cybersecurity organizations. And you see many of the percentages reflecting what we found in the interviews as well. So more and more demand for standardization and compliance regulations instead of the importance of risk management, which is only emphasized by 10%. You're seeing the successful involvement of management. However, you're also seeing lack of resources, lack of budget. So it means it gets the attention of the C-level. It doesn't get you more money at the C-level or more people. Because the majority is basically saying, well, just reallocate your money. So take people, for example, from the operational cybersecurity part and put them into the compliance department, because that's my number one priority. If I'm not compliant, I have to risk compliance. And then finally, in collaboration with government, you're seeing a very modest score, 6.59, as an overall out of 10. So the collaboration with government is also great. So when we put that as a final exercise in the diagram, in one diagram, we wanted to find out if there was an interrelatedness, because we found that many of the people were sort of talking in coherent ways on the second order themes. And this sort of complex picture actually displays the interdependencies. And if you read it properly, you can start it from the top. So you need to protect society against disruption. That's what organizations and government need to do together. There is a dynamic nature, which is inevitable. It's part of working with technology and looking at the presentation from today and tomorrow. You can basically see that as well. So that means you always have a residual digital security risk. So that's a given. However, if you put all the other second order themes beneath them, you are basically increasing the residual risk. So for example, if you just focus on compliance, which is this part of the first tension, it means you are increasing your residual risk. If you are doing compliance and you're doing liability, then you're forcing into compliance because that's the only thing you can hold up in court. And it means you are even increasing it further. And then with the big tech, the willingness to pay, which isn't there, then that makes it into a total overview of the potential big digital risk where you want to minimize it as possible. So that's, I think, the final slide now. Questions?
Question?
Sure.
How is it affect with big or medium companies because they have different countries with different laws? In the point of view of that company and the law, because they have a big company, they operate with a different contents, and in the point of view of the company, they want maybe only one regulation, not all the contents, completely different.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. What they wanted to do after the NIS1 to have a more protected Europe. However, the European Union, as the way it's constructed, is not allowed to do something on national security. The moment you touch upon critical infrastructure or national security, it becomes local law, which cannot be governed by Brussels. So the ending result is that in all 27 countries, there are very many differences in the way they actually implement the operational measures. So now the result is that organizations being active in Europe are actually finding that it is different in Bulgaria versus the Netherlands versus any country. And that's not something the EU can easily solve. So that's the only way they can solve is to make it even more specific, because then there's less room to actually change it locally. But it takes around 6 years to update a European directive. So that means it's come out in 2022. So that means in 2028 you may have the first one coming in. And if you just look at the NIS2 coming out in 22, we did the research in 2022, 23. And then, for example, ChatGPT came in. And it's not covered in any measure. So how do you deal with AI, with algorithms, with using AI within the cybersecurity domain or in the organization? And is that a cybersecurity topic? And that's simply then, so then you see people sort of say, well, there's no, so how do I deal with that? So you're fully right. It is very, by making it more explicit, you are creating diversification. And that's even just within Europe, let alone getting supplies in from the Middle East or from. The downside is there's something called the normative theory, which states that it is good to have a global norm. However, it takes more and more time to create a global norm. So the more people you put in the room, the more difficult it becomes to get them to agree on a norm. So ideally, you would have a global norm on how to deal with digital risk. However, if you have countries in there who are actually maybe even considering using it for malicious purposes, it's very difficult to get agreement in that. And the best example you can find in the ITU, International Telecom Unions, on the disturbance of radio signals and frequencies, etc. So it's a puzzle. But that's also why we ended with this. Because we're saying, well, you need to understand that puzzle in order to understand that this is never perfect. There's no perfect here. It's always imperfect. And if you don't understand why it's imperfect, it's very difficult to get any kind of liability. But thank you for your question.
Any more questions?
Or from the audience?
Yes,
I don't see any hands up.
we apply that in your country, Netherlands? Is it fine?
Yeah. When I finished the paper, the preliminary results of this, the first editions of this, the final workshop was held with the Dutch government, so the ones who wrote actually the Dutch law. And the law wasn't finished, so they were still in that, they were also in this interbellum. And what I found very interesting is that after I gave them this presentation, but then on a 2-hour time frame, so a bit more extensive, they actually changed the law to reduce the focus on compliance and to move them more into please start with digital risk management and then compliance will follow. So they changed some of the sentences in the what they call the guidance memorandum of the law to actually make sure that they implemented some of the learnings from this. So that was kind of interesting to see that they actually recognized what we found, but also were able to sort of do some last-minute redirection. Simultaneously, we're now, as soon as this publication has become official, we are looking to see if we can approach the European Union, for example. So there's now the NIS2, so there will most likely be a NIS3 in a couple of years. So are there insights in this study that may actually help them to improve the NIS3 in a better way? So yes. You're welcome.